Well, hello, everyone. This is Kara Caruthers again, your president for PAEA for 2022. And in the month of May, we celebrate Asian American and Pacific Islander Month. And so I am so fortunate today to have a fellow PA educator to talk about this important month and the great things that he is doing in the state of Hawaii. So Kaidden, I'm going to turn it over to you for you to share a little bit about yourself, your PA journey, and then your PA education journey.
Thank you so much, Kara. And thank you again for allowing me to have this opportunity to share about the new developing PA program here in Hawaii and, our mission and what we're trying to do here for our community. So just a little bit about myself. So my name is Kaidden Kelly. I was born and raised here on the big island of Hawaii. I grew up primarily on the Hilo side. I went to and attended the Kamehameha schools, which is a private boarding and non-boarding school for people who have Native Hawaiian ancestry, pure or part Aboriginal blood. So I grew up around my culture, I grew up around my community, and knew I wanted to impact my community from a healthcare level. So my mom is a registered nurse and has been for over 30 years here on the island. And so I always grew up around hospitals, nursing homes, clinics, and I've always been inspired by that. So about my education background, I had the opportunity to attend Portland State University in Oregon. I got my bachelor's degree in health studies. And that was actually where I was introduced to the first PA I ever met in my life. So at the time, I was a junior at Portland State, and I had an opportunity to volunteer at the Virtue OHSU Surgical Simulation Lab at Oregon Health and Science University, where I was able to assist the medical director of the Department of Surgery with workshops for med students and residents in their simulation space. And that in turn allowed me to have some shadowing opportunities. And so one day I was shadowing the medical director, and his PA comes in, and the first case I ever shadowed on was a laparoscopic Nissen. And she just comes in, she's scrubbed in, and she knows what she's doing, and she assists him, and then she leaves and goes and rounds on patients. And I was like, wow. So you tell me you can do all of this stuff and have a master's degree and you don't need to go to medical school? So that's when I kind of thought about like, this is a really excellent opportunity for someone who may be medically trained in a different specialty that maybe isn't nursing, so maybe an EMT, that can go back and get formal training and then go ahead and become a provider. So that sparked some flames, but I was still honestly not quite focused on the PA route. I was thinking more public health. Graduated. A year later, I moved back home. I started working as a medical assistant in our community at a primary care office, and also he did HIV care as well. He's an HIV specialist. And he also owned a sleep lab. So I kind of worked as an MA in both primary care and sleep medicine. Then I got trained as a sleep technologist, worked for a couple of years, and just decided I wanted to further my education. I remembered about that PA I met at OHSU. And so I applied to many different schools. Because the first thing that I noticed right off the bat when I was looking at PA schools was there's no PA school in the state of Hawaii. And so, of course, that broke my heart. I really didn't want to leave home, but I knew that this was something I wanted to do. And so I kind of went for it. I applied to 6 different schools. I interviewed and got into the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine, the Philadelphia campus, and had that opportunity to go there. I also was able to, so I also recognized that PA school is very expensive, regardless of where you go, and looked at many different scholarship opportunities that I could have qualified for. And so I applied to 2 scholarship opportunities, the National Health Service Corps and also the Native Hawaiian Health Scholarship Program, which is a subset of the National Health Service Corps. And I was lucky enough to have received one of the awards. So I had my master's degree fully paid for through the National Health Service Corps. Now, in turn, after completing the program, I had a service obligation to come back home specific to Hawaii and serve in an underserved or rural area in the state of Hawaii, which in actuality is the entire state. So that wasn't a big deal breaker for me. That was actually what I wanted to do. So I was like, yeah, duh. So I did. And so I applied to all of the FQHCs here in the state of Hawaii and also rural healthcare centers, and interviewed and accepted at, and hired at a rural healthcare center here on the Big Island called Kipuka o Keola. And it is a rural healthcare center that focuses on primary care, but mostly mental health of Native Hawaiians. And it's not that we're exclusive to Native Hawaiians per se, but our patient demographic had at that time, now this was 2019, over 40% of our patient demographic was identified as Native Hawaiian. So that's huge. And so I was lucky enough to work with the adult and child psychiatrist there, who I worked with over about a year or so right off the bat. And so I saw things from, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder to your heartbreaking foster care, conduct disorder, type patients, and seeing that wide variety of patients who have mental health disorders, and especially in my community, being a Native Hawaiian, it really sparked my passion and really solidified my desire to commit to working in the field of mental health. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think that is a striking contrast to what we typically think of Hawaii. So I have actually cousins in Pearl City because I had a great aunt and uncle there for about 25 years. But I've been to Hawaii on vacation, right? Went to Oahu, Waikiki Beach, rented a car, drove around, found, beaches tucked up off the hidden path, had some fantastic barbecue and all sorts of treats, right? And so the visual that I think all of us have of Hawaii is this beautiful, you surf, the palm trees, the blue ocean, right? The zen that you feel and relaxation. But really from what you're sharing and what I came across an article in Frontiers and Public Health that says Native Hawaiians have not only a shorter life expectancy than any other ethnic and racial group in Hawaii, but Native Hawaiians have 3 times the rates of coronary artery disease, strokes, heart failure, cancer, diabetes. Now, of course, and it definitely makes sense, there's also a mental health issue there as well. So how do we balance that? What do you hope to do now as you've shifted to a PA educator? What do you hope to impart to your students and even to your fellow colleagues that might not be Native Hawaiians, and really the rest of us? Why is this important?
Absolutely. I think that's a great question to ask. And really, so when I think about kind of racial and ethnic disparities, I like to think about the historical context of the last 100 to 200 years of these populations of people, right? And so we do know that the Hawaiian monarchy, and this does really stem back to 1776 when there were Westerners that came and started or discovered Hawaii,
Yeah, let's
and
discover.
right,
Yes, yeah,
discovered, right,
discovered.
because there
Yeah,
were people here before.
yeah.
Um, and so really, with that and the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy that happened in the late 1800s, created a lot of, I think, distrust with Westerners, created a lot of disparity, especially with the how lands were kind of divided. So in Native Hawaiians, typically the philosophy here is that everyone is responsible for the land. There's no ownership, no one owns it. And now, Westerners came in, overthrew the monarchy, dispossessed Native Hawaiians of land. And so once you dispossess Native people of their lands, that's when they start to feel like they're not connected to who they are, so their culture, and they have a harder time getting access to food and to their own resources. And then also the introduction of diseases, both communicable and non-communicable type diseases, which then lead to a lot more mental health disorders, which then we know lead to a lot more physical health disorders. And so when approaching, especially any type of minority patient demographic, especially with Native Hawaiians, you're gonna want to think about, why are these people being more afflicted by these disorders than maybe their counterparts? And so if you kind of think about like someone walking into your house and telling you to get out because you're no longer the owner, which is kind of essentially what happened to Native Hawaiians, that's really kind of off-putting. So it's a whole gamut of things.
Yeah. So that for sure is like racial trauma, like, and that's been generational, which
absolutely
it makes sense that there's, disparity, because again, we think about disparity, oh, well, you just have to eat healthy. Well, it's a little bit more nuanced than just, not eating barbecue and eating fish. Like it's a lot more because of that trauma that has been endured. Wow. Well, I'm gonna let you keep talking. I don't want to interrupt you. So
no.
So I guess from what you saw in clinic, and yes, you are a Native Hawaiian, you've seen firsthand, your mom is in healthcare as well. You recognize the disconnect, and that there weren't enough providers, enough clinicians to serve. And I'll say it this way, there weren't enough culturally humble clinicians to serve the population. So what caused you to shift? Was it just recognizing, hey, I can impact in clinic, but I can have a wider impact by helping to mold a homegrown generation of clinicians, and you can kind of have this dual impact? So kind of walk me through like how you shifted.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of years ago, I heard about the University of Washington MEDEX physician assistant program starting to open a campus here, and they were doing a lot of outreach. They had a lot of students on clinical rotations in the state of Hawaii with our practitioners and hospitals and clinics. And they had done a town hall meeting, I want to say back in 2018, in the Kona community. And I just went to check it out. And, that's when I met the program director, Terry Scott. I think Dr. Miss Vakeen was also the vice chair at the time, or medical director. And so all these leaders within the MEDEX Northwest community came in and did an info session. And I'll be quite honest and say I left that info session very hopeful, but also very much like, we'll see if this happens. We'll actually see if this happens. And so one day I came to work, and my coworker, who's also a PA, came back. We came back from a long weekend, and she was like, "Hey, guess what I did this weekend? I went and I interviewed for the first Kona class for the MEDEX PA program." And I was like, "Oh, don't you say, like, this is actually happening?" And she's like, "Yeah." And so I just kind of thought, like, all right, maybe they need help. I mean, there's not a lot of PAs on this island in general. So at the time, you could count the number of PAs on two hands.
Oh, wow.
Um, yeah. And I just kind of reached out and said, "Hey, here's my CV. Like, I'm not looking for a job, but if you need someone to come and do guest lectures or whatnot, I'm available." And so they had actually replied and said, "Hey, can you please apply if you're considering a job?" And so I did, and kind of here I am. And so I think I instinctively applied for, of course, two reasons. I think having grown up here and having applied to PA school and knowing that there wasn't a PA program here, I really wanted to make sure that this program stays on this island and in the Hawaiian Islands. We need this for our community. There's a huge shortage of medical providers in the state, and we're just one of the many solutions that can help. And two, I think that I also took this job to ensure that a lot of the providers that are being trained in the state of Hawaii actually are from here and want to stay here. One of our problems here in the state is and this is to no one's fault, right? Because we have this medical shortage of providers everywhere, but here in our state, it's a little different. Different culture, different way of living. The cost of living is very high, comparable to Manhattan and New York City. And so even physicians have a hard time staying here after a year or two. And most of the time they're unfamiliar with the culture, they're unfamiliar with the lifestyle and the people. And so it's hard for a lot of Native Hawaiians to relate to people who come from different cultures. So they end up coming and leaving and coming and leaving. And so a lot of that is abandonment and can be traumatic for a lot of Native Hawaiians in itself, with that lack of continuity of care. And so that's also kind of part of the mission here, is to ensure that the people here also have the power and have the capability to get educated and have that opportunity to serve.
Right. So you brought up a good point in that sometimes we can go into communities to offer our medical expertise as PAs or other clinicians. And we don't always take the time to learn those communities, learn those community-specific mores and values and traditions. What are some things, again, just thinking and speaking to fellow PA educators, how are ways we can incorporate that mindfulness in our curriculum to our students?
Absolutely. I think one of the first things, of course, is thinking about the historical context. I think is super huge. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like a formal lecture about many different ethnic groups. I think it's also trying to understand maybe some of the social determinants of the people in which you're practicing, I think is really huge. So who's the biggest kind of payer for their Medicaid and Medicare services within that state? Also kind of knowing what are the resources around in that area for the community. So do they have, like, let's say, a community wellness center, or is there, parks, or are there pools that's accessible for the people? Or even, so Native Hawaiians, if they do qualify, could also be living on Hawaiian homestead lands. So if Native Hawaiian person has at least 50% or more Aboriginal blood, then they are not quite gifted, but they are sort of gifted a land to build a house on from the government. And so it's kind of thinking about those types of things and the resources around in those areas. So do they have access to water or electricity? If you're setting up a telemedicine visit, do they know how to use that? Or even thinking about what type of languages or even pidgin languages might be used in that area. So a lot of people in Hawaii tend to be multicultural as well. That's kind of the norm here.
Mhm.
So myself, I'm part Native Hawaiian. I'm also Portuguese. I'm also Spanish and Puerto Rican. So I check a lot of boxes, and a lot of people here do. So it's also kind of thinking about, communicating across many different cultures can mean using many different words from many different languages, especially
Right,
here.
right, right. Well, what about like because you all have a class right now, correct? Have a class of
Yes.
students, right? Okay. In the curriculum, do you all, I know many of the elders that are Native Hawaiian use traditional Hawaiian medicine. And we see that in other cultures as well, where there's, certain herbal remedies. And how do you explain that or integrate some of that with your students as they're going out clinical rotations, having clinical experiences? How do you incorporate that information?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So we're in our first Kona class, so that they're going to be graduating in August this year. We're super excited. We have
Right.
17. And we also have Kona class 2. So we have 23 students in that class who are set to go out on rotations in September. Now we like to, and so this year we had a la'au lapa'au. So that is the Hawaiian word for kind of traditional Hawaiian medicine. So using herbs and plants that are native to Hawaii for healing. So we had a practitioner come in and do a 2-hour, just kind of brief introduction to the different types of plants that are used for Native Hawaiians, or that they may see or hear of in practice. And really, it's when we teach it in our curriculum, it's not, again, a formal class. It's more so like, this is what you may see out on rotations. And these are the types of, or these certain drugs may interact with, so-and-so type of thing. But really, a lot of that they will see in clinical practice. So the practice that I started out at, we had psychiatry, we had primary care, and we also had traditional Hawaiian medicine.
Oh, nice.
So it can be very, very helpful if the practice is set up that way too. At some point, they will see it.
Yes, absolutely. So again, because you are such a wealth of information and because you are there, I am low-key a little jealous. But if y'all need a graduation speaker, I'm happy to come.
Hey, all right.
Let me just throw that out there.
Maybe. We got Kona class 1 speaker on, but maybe 2.
Okay.
Maybe 2, Kara. Seriously.
So, but what are some things, again, I'm thinking, so I'm from Omaha, Nebraska originally, and Creighton University is there. So my younger sister attended Creighton, and they had a number of Native Hawaiian students that came to Omaha, Nebraska for undergrad. And so while we're talking about the state of Hawaii, people are like, oh, well, that's, that area. But we know our students will graduate and practice all over the United States and its territories. As you know, we have a program in Puerto Rico as well now, as well as we have students, we have people, Americans that travel and move and migrate and all of that. So what are some things that all PA programs can think about when we think about Native Hawaiians, some of the healthcare disparities and the health inequities that exist because of a variety of reasons? We've talked about racism, there's colonialism, there's all sorts of isms, right, that we know influence. But what are some things that all of us can think about and incorporate and share with our students to make sure that we're training culturally humble practitioners to go out and care for every person in every community? What are some things you would share for us?
Absolutely. And there's a whole lot of things, right, that we can get into. But I think one of the things that aren't really thought about or even taught in schools is thinking about, how can you relate to these patients? And the top way to do that with any Native Hawaiian is thinking about the family unit. Every decision that is made when it comes to a patient is made with the family in mind. So a lot of the time, we as clinicians want our patient to make decisions and make them quickly, especially if they're high impact type decisions, maybe even something as simple to us as starting a medication for depression. For us, it's like, it could be a straightforward answer of like, yeah, your PHQ-9 is through the roof and, you have all these behaviors that aren't very healthy. But again, it goes back to, all right, that person's probably thinking about how their mom may view them or how their grandma or their kupuna may kind of view them if they take a medication. So just kind of know that sometimes you also have to include not just the patient, but the family unit in decision making, even if it seems very simple. Also, the Native Hawaiian community is also very close-knit. So everyone kind of knows each other. So sometimes the lines get blurred. I've treated high school teachers, I've treated family members, like distant cousins, but still cousins, right? So even just remembering that, people have their privacy as well.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So what do you want your legacy to be? So as you are a Native Hawaiian, you have this fantastic opportunity to pour into a group of young sponge-like minds who have a commitment to the culture. They have a commitment to Hawaii. They want to serve the Native Hawaiians. What will your ultimate legacy be? If we were to go 50 years in advance speed, and you look back, what is your legacy going to be?
Man, what a question. If we're still here in 50 years, like that is right there, the legacy, seriously. If this program is self-sustaining here in the state of Hawaii, I think that's huge. But I also want the legacy really to also include how we view healthcare providers in general in our state. Right now, we look at physicians and think they're kind of the end all say all, which has been kind of historically accurate for quite some time. But now with a lot of, since COVID, we've had a lot of people kind of move to the islands from the mainland. We've also, just had a lot more population growth in general. And so physicians aren't going to be the only answers. And so then the next, I guess most common provider you'll see in the state of Hawaii are nurse practitioners, which nothing against nurse practitioners, but they're also limited to what they can do and the amount of training that they get, right? And so PAs in the state of Hawaii, I'm constantly educating people about what my role is and what I can do. And part of my legacy is to hopefully change that viewpoint of healthcare being a team rather than a paternalistic, view just as a physician.
Nice. Well, I think, Kaidden, that is a fantastic legacy. And I think it's doable. So even when we think about the origin of Asian American Pacific Islander Month, it started in 1977 by representatives in Congress President Jimmy Carter was like, this is a great idea, started as a week, and by 1990, it became a full month. So 1977 is almost 50 years ago. I mean, I was 1 year old then, so I'm not 50 yet, people, not 50 yet, but
still young.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So because the celebration of Asian American Pacific Islanders, which include our Native Hawaiian family, I think in 50 years that the MEDEX Kona program will still be there, and that PAs such as yourself who are invested in the rich culture, history, heritage, and legacy of the Native Hawaiian peoples, I think we're going to be all right.
I sure hope so. Thank you for believing in us, and thank you for supporting us as well. This program would have not been possible without the support of PAEA, AAPI, of course, the University of Washington, our legislators, our supporters, and the island community. Can't thank the community enough, because it really took a lot of community support and to move this campus along.
Yes, awesome. Well, Kaidden, I appreciate you. I know we have a bit of a time difference, but I appreciate your time and your willingness. And I have no doubt that you and I will connect again in the near future. I'm already thinking of some research, sir, some papers that we can do and collaborate on. So I will for sure keep in touch. And again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much again. And I look forward to working with you in the future.
Awesome. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us as we celebrate Asian American Pacific Islander Month.